I'd just like to open by saying what an honour it is to be emceeing today's event. Diversity and inclusion are two topics that are very close to my heart, though if you booked a ticket for today, I'd like to think that they're priorities for you too, as well as the chance for a free breakfast, of course. When I was first brought into the B&TU team earlier this year, I was tasked with covering our diversity and inclusion content. Above all, it's been a very humbling experience. I wasn't quite prepared for how many people would be out there doing not just brilliant, but potentially revolutionary work in the D&I space. The theme of changing the ratio this year is belonging, it starts with you. What does belonging look like in our industry? For me, it looks like an Adland that represents the actual makeup of Australia in terms of religion, age, gender, socioeconomic background, race, and sexuality. That needs to hold true at every level of our industry, from the boardroom to the writer's room, to the strategy room, the finance department, the social media team, behind the cameras and in front of them too. As a woman, and as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, I can safely say that diversity, inclusion, representation, they're far more than ticking boxes or filling quotas. They're about power. Watching people like you actively succeed shows people from diverse backgrounds that they can thrive in their careers. And with every step, make things just a little bit better for those who will come after them too. Changing the ratio is sort of a funny event because the ultimate goal really is that one day we won't need it anymore. But until that point, it's a real honour to be welcoming our speakers for today. They represent not only some of the most important figures in our industry right now, but they also show how it could, and hopefully will, look in the future. Today's event will focus on a number of different pillars, including Indigenous employment and retention, creating products that centre people with disability, and spotlighting cultural diversity in Adland. It's now time to kick off our first session titled Transforming Spaces, How Adland Can Ensure Indigenous Australians Thrive. This session is sponsored by OMD, and to introduce the session, please welcome Philippa Moig, Business Director at OMD, who is also a key member of OMD's RAP committee.
Good morning, everyone. How are we?
Excellent.
Thanks, Sparrow. So I'd like to start by welcoming you all in the local Darug language, those of the people of the Eora Nation. So Warami, Ingini, hello and welcome. So as mentioned, I'm Philippa Moig from OMD. I'm up here today as a really proud member of RAP, which is our Reconciliation Action Plan Committee, and that's been formed as part of the OMD Diversity and Inclusion Charter. Within that charter, we focus on having really clear plans, but also measurable outcomes. So from that short video, you would have seen some of the things that we're doing at OMD. We started on our RAP journey in 2017, and today is very much a continuation on that journey and continuing to expand in what we're doing. So our RAP committee helps bring many of the important topics to the forefront of OMD to make sure that we're creating the most inclusive environment. So from a personal point of view, I actually joined RAP because I think the Indigenous culture is absolutely beautiful, something that's over 65,000 years old. I actually married a Wurundjeri man, and through that connection, I've been on a personal journey of education, storytelling, community, friendship, and understanding the power of connection and belonging. So it is with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce to you today Marley Silva, who will be talking to us about how Adland can ensure Indigenous Australians thrive. Marley is a very proud Gamilaroi Dunghutti woman. She is an absolute powerhouse when it comes to elevating conversations that we need to have and in driving social change. Marley is the author of a beautiful book, which I was just glowing to her about, My Titta, My Sister, and it's a beautiful collection of Indigenous women's stories around power, resilience and courage. She's the creator of the social initiative Titters for Titters on Facebook and Insta, and she's the host behind a fabulous podcast, Always Will, Always Was, Always Will Be, Always Our Stories. So please join me in welcoming Marley to the stage and giving her a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Whoa.
Thank you so much, Philippa. I think you might have been a little bit too kind with that kind of introduction, but I really do appreciate it. And I want to start by saying Yama, which is how you say hello in the Gamilaroi language of my people. Yes, my name is Marley Silva, and it is really special to be here today, especially as I started having this conversation with B&T that I would be a part of this in 2019. We can remember that was a time when we didn't even know what COVID was, and then all the nightmare happened, but we've actually made it, and we're here in real life, seeing real people eating breakfast together. So I'm really stoked about that, but it hasn't been without its technical difficulties, including that microphone just explosion. But that's why I'm on my phone, because of course my printer decided to die last night. Yes, as we said, I am a very proud Gamilaroi and Dunghutti woman. They are both tribes in more northern parts of New South Wales, but I was born and raised on Darawal country, just south of Sydney. I call it God's country. You might know it as the Sutherland Shire. And it is a true pleasure to be here today. Before I begin, I want to start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the country that we are on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and extend those respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are also in the room. As an Aboriginal woman, this place of Barangaroo always feels particularly special to me to be on, especially as I remember the stories of its namesake, one of our most fearless leaders from history, Barangaroo the woman. Her stories of defiance, of passion for her people, and bravery is seeped in the soil of this country and the Camaragal country where her people are from to the north. Standing here, I also think of the other fisherwomen of Eora, who, prior to invasion, skillfully dominated its coastlines. They were the main food providers for their families, were incredibly skillful in their fishing, swimming, diving, and sailing, and they travelled across that big body of water that we now call Sydney Harbour in hand-carved bark canoes called Nawis. Often heard singing as they went, the Eora fisherwomen were seen fishing all day, in all weathers, and at night as well. The diary entries from the settlers of that time also describe them as looking like fireflies dancing across the water in the dark. They fascinated those men with their ability to manage fires lit on clay pads in the base of their canoes, paddling often with babies at their breasts and unafraid in surf that would terrify the toughest sailors. And it's the spirits of these powerful, inspiring, resilient and vital leaders and providers that I keep in mind today, and hope each of you who have travelled to this country to find strength and inspiration in it too. As these stories exist everywhere that makes up this great continent we now call Australia. And mostly I encourage all of you every day to remember that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now today I'm tasked with providing some thoughts on this rather large question. How do Australian organisations build culturally safe offices that not only foster diversity in their workforce, but also develop sustainable, prosperous environments for long-term career paths of First Nations people? And while I'm not going to claim to be any kind of workplace culture expert, I'm a writer amongst a few other things. And I've actually been working for myself and nowhere near an office space for the last 18 months. So that may have diluted some of my expertise if I did have any anyway. But the experience that I've had previously in the workforce as a young Aboriginal person have shown me some of the best and some of the not so great examples of the ideal working environment. And here's the key, an environment where I could not just exist and feel safe as an Aboriginal person, but truly thrive and grow. And that's what I want to share with you today. But before I jump into it, I must emphasise, I'm only speaking for myself and not on behalf of anyone else. And these discussions are by no means comprehensive and should be seen as a starting point to leapfrog off into more conversations and, most importantly, into action. In order to understand what the journey of being in the workplace as an Aboriginal person can feel like, I want you all now to imagine this. You're 12 years old again, and a few weeks into your first year of high school. You feel weird already because of the newness of your body you're growing into. The things you feel unsure about that have never bothered you before. Maybe you have a bad haircut. I personally had terrible bangs. Maybe you have acne, braces. the insecurities are slowly building up. But unlike your peers who are facing those same things, there's something else about you that makes you particularly different. Something about your identity. Something that you never realised made you different at all until one of your classmates points it out. Suddenly, that innocent awkwardness turns into feelings of being an outcast. Because it's not just your peers who snicker or make comments, who whisper things as you walk by, but it's teachers too. The authority you're faced with every day, so it turns out, has expectations of you because of something that's different about you that you can't change. Fast forward a few years and you've made it through the wilderness that is high school, not without a few scars and a few barriers you've already built up, but you're excited and hopeful because the real world is finally on the horizon. It's time for uni, a fresh start, where there's more people like you, where your peers are older and surely more mature, where you won't face that feeling of an outsider anymore, right? But once again, the rug is pulled out from under you. You walk into lecture halls where you and people like you are the subject. You find yourself spoken about as if you're not in the room. As if people like you couldn't possibly make it into that university lecture hall. And you're let down again by the realisation, even in the real world, a good chunk of people don't understand who you are or have distorted perspectives of what you're capable of. Now we jump forward another couple of years. You've graduated again, and now finally, surely you're in the real world, and this will be where you belong. It's time for the workforce. You're in an industry that you've chosen, you're flexing the skills that you've worked so hard to refine, and you've once again mustered the hopefulness that comfort in spaces around people who aren't like you can actually be achieved. You're settling into the new office world. Those early morning alarms are a struggle, but like your colleagues, you like your colleagues and the challenge of your work. But then, January 26 comes around on the calendar, and it's the talk of the lunchroom. A headline breaks with statistics or horror stories about an issue that plagues Indigenous communities. The age-old debate of the Australian flag or the anthem is thrust into the media again. And those around you reveal themselves to hold the attitudes you'd been so sure you'd finally escaped. This is what it can be like for First Nations people in this country. The cycle of seeking belonging outside of our families and the safety of our communities is something I have seen and personally felt myself pursuing again and again. And when we can't find it, when we have that moment of, oh no, am I actually supposed to be here? That imposter syndrome completely overwhelming us. Can the rest of you truly be surprised that the retention of First Nations staff in majority non-Indigenous industries can be so difficult? And it's not just about building a level of cultural competency in your staff. It's not just about putting policies in place when it comes to these sorts of incidences. And it's not just about building identified positions for First Nations people to grow the diversity in your teams. It's about embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives into every facet of your work. And I truly believe, regardless of what it is that you do and what industry you're in, any business operating in Australia, and therefore operating on Aboriginal land, must uphold this as best practice. Some of you might already know this, but in the industry that each of you in this room represent, the data suggests that the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the arts and media industries, which is inclusive of advertising, is too insignificant to report on at all. And that statistic is not from 20 years ago. It is from a Ray Morgan study released in 2018. Sit on that for a minute. The oldest continuing surviving culture on Earth, a culture which is renowned the world over for its art and its storytelling, has a presence in the arts and media industry in Australia that is statistically insignificant. How on earth is this still the case? Well, that's a question that I don't have the answer to. And it's one that you guys have to figure out by holding a mirror to yourselves. What are you doing in your organisation? How are you engaging First Nations people? It's time to get experts from our community, thought leaders and dismantle the ways that you might be contributing to power structures that continue to hold us back. And that has to be where you start. Now, I'm not going to do that work for you, mostly because I'm not qualified, as I've mentioned multiple times now. But I'm going to give you some tips now as a starting point, which I've learned from the workplaces that I've been in. First of all, you have to know where you are. I started this speech by telling you a story that's a bit about the history of the country that you're on. Grounding yourself in that place, in that history, not only builds a reciprocal respect for the country that you have the privilege of existing on and working on, but it also, when you build it into your workplace, shows your staff that that's something that they absolutely have to do. And it's also about not just knowing that knowledge, but engaging with the community that still exists connected to this country today. Again, we are on a sovereign, unceded land, stolen land, and engaging with the people who are connected to it is absolutely vital. On the back of that, the second tip would be to know who you are. And that's where your cultural competency training comes in for your staff. Like I said, it's not the only thing, but you do have to start with that. We all have unconscious bias, and we should all be working to dismantle it continuously. You don't get to the end of a cultural competency training course and tick you're done and you're done for the rest of your life. This is something that you continuously work on. And and you have to ask yourself internally, what is it that you need to dismantle? What are the current barriers that still exist? And how many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are in your organisation? Do they feel comfortable identifying? If not, why? If there are no people there, you really have to be so investigative of what it is that is holding people back in your organisation. Number 3, and this is part of the answer to how you dismantle some of this, you must value Indigenous ways of working. So one of the big buzzwords of the moment across the board is sustainability, right? And thinking about how we look forward to the future with such an uncertain future, we can't deny that things like climate change or the way that the world is changing in so many different ways is something we have to consider. I like to say, invented sustainability. We've been around longer than anyone else. We know how to survive. We've survived ice ages and everything else. But not only have we survived in a physical sense with our connection to the environment, but our means of communication, our ways of connecting to one another have stayed relatively the same for this amount of time as well. And there's so much in that I am constantly learning as an Aboriginal person, and that I find so much strength and knowledge in that absolutely everyone else who works in any kind of environment needs to tap into. Diversity, obviously, that's another massive buzzword and one of the key ones of today's event. And this is something that, again, you can learn so much from Aboriginal communities because we are not a monoculture. It's why I emphasise that I'm only speaking for myself today. The diversity that we have within our communities, again, is so rich and can continue to provide so many different perspectives and knowledges. At the end of the day, the organisations that each of you represent play a role in showing the country what Australia looks like and who we are. And I think it can't be underestimated the power that you have in informing the rest of the country who we are and what our goals are. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the richest and deepest part of the story of this country. So we absolutely must be included, otherwise you guys will end up being the ones left behind. Leadership must be the place of representation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. For me personally, I think that having Aboriginal people in leadership and my ability I've had the great privilege of having a boss who was an older Aboriginal woman, and for me it was so vital as a young Aboriginal person in my workplace. It was the single most important shift in my understanding of who I wanted to be as a professional and my own capabilities. And having that experience at a young age in the workforce, that's where the retainment of young Aboriginal people coming through the industry exists. Where are the pipelines for First Nations people, not just to exist in a workforce, but to be at a managing level or to be in a leadership position? That's where I think the next stage in employment and career paths has to be. We do have good measures in place for trying to get more Aboriginal people in their foot in the door to begin with, but leadership is really where it needs to be to not only encourage more young people coming through and continue to grow that number, but to also influence from the top down the directions that you're going in. The next one is probably the most important. I've written here 0 off days. So that means that and talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, questioning when they aren't in the room, why, making sure that our knowledge is put at the forefront and that we are being included in every single conversation must be a priority 365 days a year. Not just when it's NAIDOC week, not just when it's Reconciliation week, and not just when it's January 26. Last year we saw, obviously with the surge of the Black Lives Matter movement, a really powerful response from so much of corporate Australia, thanks to the public pressure of a lot of people who were horrified by what they were seeing and what they were learning for the first time. Unfortunately, but unsurprisingly, it was a nice little spike of interest and people trying to do things in a reactionary way that fizzled out once it was no longer in the mainstream media. It's about making sure that this is not something we jump on and when it's a trend. It's not about posting your black square on your Instagram and tick you're done for the rest of the year or you've made some amazing change. It's a long, hard journey. It's a long, hard journey that we have been on for 250 years. And you guys must commit to it every single day of the year. And as I said, and I will continue to reiterate, this is best practice. Constantly thinking about this, constantly working on it is only going to be beneficial for your organisation. And that's something that's constantly lost in these discussions. When we talk about equality, when we talk about diversification, people often have this misconception that it is something, you will lose something in trying to achieve that someone is going to lose some power, they're going to lose something in their business, but you can only gain something, and you certainly can only gain something from the oldest continuous surviving culture on earth. But the final top tip, and the most important one, is you absolutely must listen, listen, and listen. Listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Listen to all different types of people from my community, and constantly seek out different perspectives and make sure there's no assumptions and you're just taking it straight from what we have to say. I think that's the most important thing you can do. And listening is also about constantly educating yourself and not putting the onus on your Indigenous staff to be I like to say the Aboriginal Google, as I've been in quite a few places, because we aren't experts. We can't be experts of a culture that still has 300 different countries and so many different dialects and so many different stories. So constantly seek those out, read more, diversify your own media sources and those sorts of things. Now, from where I'm sitting, Australia has been slowly and steadily taking one step forward and 3 steps back for a few decades now when it comes to bettering the experiences and opportunities of Indigenous Australia. And while it's been disheartening at times, recently and amazingly, it seems like the way COVID-19 completely threw life as we knew it and the status quo out the window, and what we've been accepting as the way things are for too long, has finally broken the floodgates and made space for the sustainable and overwhelming change in the mindsets we've been fighting for generations. I'm sure this is an unpopular opinion, and rightly so, but I have to say, while 2020 gave us some horrible moments, which I would like to quickly forget, now after over a year of surviving it, I can clearly see some of the great things, the powerful moments, and the silver linings that gave us lessons we should consider taking into a post-COVID world. We have realised that we don't need to be in an office to get our work done. We don't need to keep to the same ways of working we've always have, and we can still meet our productivity targets. And therefore, why don't we smash it all down and start again with the way that we treat our people in the workplace and how we foster the beautiful and many varied differences in each and every one of us as individuals in order to build the ideal teams who can and must influence the change that we need to see. Do not underestimate what this industry can do. Perception is power, and we all deserve a brighter future in this country, where we truly have an equal and level playing field. Just imagine the possibilities of 60,000 years of survival and creativity. It's almost too big and thrilling to wrap your head around. But if you're not already, I hope you're leaving today bursting with ideas and questions about what you can and should be doing to invite us, First Nations people, into the spotlight and into your work. Thank you very much.